So if all we've done is produce wealth in this country, just how did we end up with this much debt?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that's the one that actually got me to studying the whole concept of how our monetary system works in the beginning, is just how do we get into this much debt when all we do is create wealth? And of course, anytime you go to solve any problem, the first thing, if you perceive there's a problem, one thing, then you've got to study till you understand the problem. And if you don't really understand the problem, you can never come up with a workable solution to any problem. And of course, that's what I have spent the last 26 or so years of my life trying to understand why we have such a financial problems and constant over and over again. If anybody's ever watched that IOU USA video, I mean, they just have president after president on there they start with talking about how the economy is in such bad shape and what they're going to do, but it never seems to change. So if it's either that they never have understood the problem or they don't want to solve the problem, or it would be solved. And that's what I have spent most of my adult life since for the last 26 years or better, is trying to really understand why we have economic problems and what we should do about it and how we can correct them. And the one thing we have really worked on recently is a bill that we have introduced into the, we had it introduced into the Minnesota legislature by a senator and a House member and several people that signed on to the bill as co-sponsors. And it's a bill to basically solve a lot of our economic problems in the state, and hopefully it would expand into where it would do it for the whole entire nation. But it's a very interesting concept, and it's based on, first off, what is really wrong with our system, our monetary system. And you hear all kinds of things. We just spend too much money, and we print too much money, and we do all kinds of things. But it tells you that, well, wait a minute, if we print too much money, why does a man who can print his own money have to borrow from anybody? And why would he borrow from anybody? Because after all, he's the one that has the authority and the power to print up the money. So there's got to be something really wrong in that concept, and so that's what I first studied, was exactly how does this work. And Russell Monk said, well, it's created, all money's created when you borrow from a bank. Oh, okay. That's reasonable, it's logical, it seems to people, because they all know they have to borrow if they really have to have unnecessary expenses or something happens, or to buy a car or buy a house. Almost everybody has to borrow for that. And the question, why? Well, of course, because there's no money unless you borrow. When you borrow, the money's created. And then you have then the next thing they never think about, well, what is the consequences of all this? And where does the money come from to pay the interest on all this? Borrowed money. And so I wrote to the Treasury and I said, well, then how is the money created? And they said, well, it's created the same way the other money's created. Basically, you have to go back and borrow some more from the bank. You or somebody else does. John Yetter said, well, the money that one, and he was an attorney advisor for the Treasury, said, well, the money that one person uses to pay interest on his debt comes from somebody else's loaned money, loan principal. So now we understand what the real problem is. Our money is all created as interest-bearing debts. Based upon the people's production, it's all backed by mortgages. All our money is backed by mortgages on the homes and other property of everybody in America. And so we know now that we have a huge problem because the money is only created as loans, and only the principal can be loaned into circulation, and therefore there's no way to create the money to pay the interest. So one of the first things we have to do is figure out how to get some money into circulation that no one borrows to pay interest. And we all understand what backs our money. Today, our money is all backed by the assets that people produce, all the wealth they produce, but as an interest-bearing loan to the bankers. So people's assets become the bankers, the people's wealth that they produce become the banker's asset and a liability that the people have to pay interest on, which doesn't make sense. So we're going to now do with the bill that we're proposing in the Minnesota legislature, and we'll call it the Minnesota Transportation Act, just for nothing, for lack of a better name to call it, because the object, pardon me, what the object of the bill is to get money into circulation that can be used to pay the interest in a way that will benefit the greater society at the same time. And we got the idea from the United States Constitution where it says Congress should coin the money and provide for post roads. So clearly now we know that we can back this money, the new money we're talking about that we created through this bill, the same exact way we back the money that we're using now with the asset the people produce. Only this time it will be an asset to the people who produce them rather to the banking system, who just simply creates an entry in the books to create the money. So now it gets a bulk of the benefit of the people's production instead of the people themselves. And this bill will start to change that a little bit, so the people themselves get the first benefit. The bankers will also get a benefit because they'll get the interest on the money they have already loaned out, and they won't have to have as many foreclosures nor near as many lawyers' fees in order to stay in business. And so they will also benefit greatly by it, but it'll also make a more smooth economy. We won't have the ups and downs. We won't have the busts and the booms, and which is very bad for everybody, morally and physically and emotionally and every other way, all these bangs and busts, because it's really great when you get your first loan and it can buy things you never could dream of, but it's really tough when that comes to an end and they come out and take your home and everything because you can't pay your mortgage payments for one reason or another. So our whole aim is to make a greater society for the benefit of everybody, working on the same exact principles that our money works now, with one small change. And that change will be that at the very beginning of the genesis of the money, when it's first created, it'll be created and spent into circulation as a payment for production done, instead of created and loaned into circulation as a mortgage on the production that was just done for the benefit of the banks. So now the people get the first benefit instead of the banks, and everybody gets a benefit, because you can have commerce without money, but you cannot have commerce without transportation. That's why it's called the Minnesota Transportation Act, because we will have the whole system work exactly the same way it does now, except with one small accounting change in the genesis of the creation of money. And with that, we will then be able to make tremendous gains for a more sustainable society. And overall, economic society and all the rest of the society will be much more sustainable once we get the concept of a correct, sustainable monetary system working. And to do this, we then wrote up a bill and introduced it. And it's really so simple that it's hard to grasp, because it is so simple. But see, it's not like any great rocket science or anything. It's just simply a play on common sense, applying common sense and some logic to what is the problem, which is too much interest-bearing debt and no way to pay the debt off. Because when money is only created as a debt, there's no way to create the money to get rid of the debt. So what we're doing to do now is create some money that we can extinguish the principal and the interest instead of just the principal alone. The way it's done now, when you pay back a loan, you extinguish the principal, but you don't the interest money, because it still stays in circulation as somebody else's loan. So your debt just grows exponentially, constantly, until finally it gets so big it just will wreck the entire economy. So that's what the whole concept of the bill is to create a way that we can put money into circulation that will be a direct payment to the people with no interest, and we can have a greater transportation system with no borrowing or no taxing of the people. Now, I don't understand what you would want better than an economy that you could have some money without debt, you could lower your taxes, and you'd have a better transportation system to carry out your commerce at the same time. I really don't understand what more you could ask for. And with that, it would take out a lot of corruption, and it would also take a lot of the misery and the poverty out of the whole system and make it work on a more even keel. And it's something that we can do immediately. We have other people that come up with solutions, but they're solutions that can't be enacted so simply. Because if you do it this way, you can start it immediately. As soon as the legislature passes a law, in less than 4 months, you could have people out there working and being paid wages to go to work. Rebuilding our infrastructure and upgrading it, and doing several other things that in compliance with that. And of course, it's not, building roads is just not hard hats and steel rods. It's engineering, it's electrical engineering, it's electrical workers and pipe fitter workers, and it's building workers, and it's carpenters, and it's steel workers, and then it's all the people in the background manufacturing all these things. It's also the people that manufacture the big equipment, and the oil that runs the equipment, and the inspectors that make sure that everybody does their job correctly so bridges don't fall down.